My daughter said, "We'll talk tomorrow," but tomorrow never came. Those were the last words my daughter, Millie, ever said to me before everything changed. At the time, I had no idea how important those 4 words would become. I thought tomorrow was guaranteed. I thought there would always be another phone call, another dinner, another conversation, another chance to tell my daughter how proud I was of her. My name is Daniel, and for most of my life, my family was the center of everything I did. My wife, Dana, and I had raised 2 children, Millie and Robert Dolan. We had watched them grow from children into adults, and even when they no longer needed us every day, I still believed they would always have a place in our lives. Millie had always been the emotional one in our family. She called her mother when she needed advice and called me when she needed someone to listen, without judging her. But during the months before that final conversation, something had changed. She became quieter. She stopped visiting as often. Sometimes she would answer my calls with a quick, "I'm busy, Dad," and promised to call later. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself that she was simply growing up and building her own life. One evening, she came to our house unexpectedly. She looked tired, and I could tell something was bothering her. Dana was in the kitchen, and Robert was visiting us too. Millie barely touched her dinner. After everyone finished eating, I followed her outside. I asked, "Millie, what's going on?" She looked at me for a long moment. "Nothing, Dad, I'm just dealing with some things." I told her that whatever it was, she could tell me. She shook her head. "Not tonight." I asked if someone had hurt her. She said no. I asked if she was having trouble at work. Again, she said no. Finally, I asked, "Then why do you look like you're carrying the whole world on your shoulders?" She smiled sadly and said, "Because maybe I am." I reached for her hand. "You don't have to carry it alone." She looked at me, and for a moment, I thought she was finally going to tell me everything. Instead, she pulled away gently and said, "Dad, I promise we'll talk tomorrow." I asked, "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Tomorrow." Those were the last words she ever said to me. The next morning, my phone rang before sunrise. It was a call that no father ever expects to receive. I answered without knowing that the life I knew was about to change forever. The voice on the other end was not Millie's. It was a woman who introduced herself as someone who had found my number in Millie's phone. Her voice was shaky, and I immediately knew something was wrong. She told me there had been an emergency during the night. I asked where Millie was. She gave me the name of a hospital. I woke Dana immediately, and within minutes, we were in the car. Robert followed us separately. I kept calling Millie's phone, but there was no answer. Every unanswered call made the silence inside the car feel heavier. Dana held my hand while I drove. She kept saying, "She'll be okay." I wanted to believe her. When we arrived at the hospital, a doctor met us near the entrance. He asked whether we were Millie's parents. I said yes. He explained that she had been brought in after a serious accident. She was receiving treatment, but the situation was critical. I felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath me. I asked if I could see her. He said they were doing everything possible and that we needed to wait. Robert arrived moments later. He looked at me and asked, "Dad, what happened?" I couldn't answer. I simply said, "Millie's hurt." We sat together for what felt like hours. Eventually, the doctor returned. He explained that Millie had suffered severe injuries and that the medical team had been unable to save her. I heard the words, but my mind refused to accept them. Dana collapsed into my arms. Robert stood completely still. I remember looking at the hospital floor and thinking about the conversation from the night before. "We'll talk tomorrow." I had believed her. I had believed there would be time. I kept thinking about all the things I had wanted to tell her. I wanted to tell her that whatever she was facing, she never had to be afraid to come home. I wanted to tell her that I was proud of her. I wanted to ask what had been troubling her. Most of all, I wanted one more chance to hear her voice. But there was no tomorrow. The days that followed were difficult for our entire family. Dana barely spoke. Robert became focused on arrangements and paperwork because he didn't know how else to deal with his grief. I walked around our house feeling as though I were waiting for Millie to walk through the door. Her room was still there. Her favorite mug was still in the kitchen. A jacket she had left behind was hanging on the chair. Every ordinary object suddenly felt important. A week after the funeral, I received a message from an unknown number. It said, "Millie wanted you to know something." I stared at the screen for several minutes. Then another message arrived. "She was afraid to tell you." I immediately called the number. A man answered. He introduced himself as Ethan, someone Millie had known through work. He said he had something that belonged to her. I asked what it was. He replied, "A notebook." Then he said something that made my heart stop. "She wrote your name on the first page." Ethan agreed to meet me the next day. I didn't tell Dana everything because I didn't want to raise her hopes about something that might be nothing. I went alone. We met at a quiet cafe, and Ethan brought a small black notebook. He placed it on the table and said, "Millie gave me this a few weeks ago. She told me that if anything happened to her, I should make sure it reached you." My hands shook as I opened it. The first page contained my name. Underneath it were the words, "For Dad?" When I'm finally ready to tell him, I had to close the notebook. I couldn't read it in front of Ethan. I asked him why Millie had been afraid. He said he didn't know everything, but she had been dealing with a difficult situation involving someone close to her. I asked whether it was a relationship. He nodded. There was a man named Victor. I immediately recognized the name. Victor had been connected to a business project I had worked on years earlier. I asked Ethan what Victor had to do with Millie. Ethan said Victor had approached her because of information about my old business. Apparently, Millie had discovered something while researching family records. She had become convinced that someone had deliberately caused financial damage to me years ago. I was shocked. I had always believed that my old business had failed because of poor decisions and difficult circumstances. Ethan told me Millie had discovered documents suggesting otherwise. I opened the notebook again. Millie had written about conversations she had with Victor. She believed he knew something about my past and was using that information to pressure her. One page contained a sentence that made me stop breathing. "Dad deserves to know the truth, but I'm afraid telling him will hurt him." I closed my eyes. My daughter had been carrying this alone while I had been telling myself she was simply busy. When I returned home, I showed the notebook to Dana and Robert. Dana cried when she read the first few pages. Robert immediately became focused. He asked whether there were names, dates, or documents. I told him yes. We read the notebook carefully. Millie had written about several meetings with Victor. She had discovered that he had once worked with people connected to my former business partners. She believed they had manipulated records years earlier. She also mentioned that someone had been pressuring her to stop investigating. Robert looked at me and said, "Dad, this could explain why Millie was so nervous." I nodded. Dana asked the question none of us wanted to ask. "Do you think someone caused the accident?" I immediately told her we had no evidence of that and we should not make assumptions. The accident had been investigated, and there was no indication of intentional harm. But the notebook made one thing clear. Millie had been afraid of something before she died. We decided to find out what she had discovered. The next morning, Robert contacted Martin, an old accountant who had worked with me years ago. Martin agreed to help. When he saw the notebook, his expression changed. "Daniel," he said, "I think your daughter found something I was afraid had been buried forever." Martin brought several boxes of old records to our house. He had kept copies from the years when my business was struggling. We spread the documents across the dining table. She had written down dates, names, account numbers, and questions. Robert compared those details with Martin's records. Slowly, a pattern began to appear. Several payments had been made from company accounts during a period when I had no knowledge of them. At the time, I had assumed my business partner had authorized those transactions. But the signatures did not match. Martin explained that he had once questioned the transactions, but he had been told not to investigate further. I asked who had given that instruction. He said it came through a manager connected to Victor. I felt a strange mixture of anger and sadness. Millie had been right. She had discovered something that I had missed for years. But why had she been so afraid to tell me? We found another entry in the notebook. It said, "Victor says Dad knows more than he admits."
I don't believe him.
I stared at that sentence. Millie had been defending me even when she wasn't sure what to believe. Another page contained a phone number and the name of a woman named Clara. Martin recognized the name immediately. Clara had worked in the accounting department during the disputed period. She had left the company suddenly. Robert searched through old records and found a forwarding address. We contacted her, and she agreed to speak with us. Clara told us that she had suspected financial records were being altered. She had tried to report it, but someone warned her that she could lose her job. She had eventually resigned. Then she revealed something shocking. Victor had been one of the people who had access to the files. Clara had seen him entering the records room several times. She could not prove what he had done, but she remembered his presence. Dana asked whether Millie had contacted her. Clara said yes. Your daughter called me about 2 weeks before the accident. My heart tightened. Clara told us that Millie had asked the same questions we were asking now. She had been trying to connect the old business records with Victor. Clara said Millie sounded worried. She had told her, "I think someone is trying to scare me into stopping." I asked whether Clara had told Millie to go to the police. Clara nodded. I told her she should protect herself and keep copies of everything. Then Clara handed me an envelope. She left this with me. Inside was a small memory card. Millie had apparently asked Clara to keep it safe. I took it home and Robert opened the files. There were photographs of documents, recordings of conversations and copies of messages. One recording contained Victor discussing the old business dispute. His words did not prove responsibility for the accident, but they showed he had been trying to pressure Millie into abandoning her investigation. Then we heard something else in the recording. A second voice mentioned my name. Robert paused the audio. We looked at each other. That voice belonged to someone we knew. The second voice belonged to a former business associate of mine named Thomas. I had not spoken to him in years. He had been involved in the original business dispute, but I had always believed our disagreements were simply financial. Now his voice appeared in a recording connected to Millie's investigation. I felt anger rising, but Robert reminded me that we needed to stay calm. We listened to the recording several times. Thomas and Victor were discussing documents related to my old company. They talked about keeping certain information away from me. They also mentioned Millie's questions. That confirmed that they knew she was investigating. But again, there was no evidence connecting them to the accident. I refused to make that accusation. I wanted the truth, not a story built from grief and suspicion. We gave the recordings and documents to the appropriate authorities and explained everything we had discovered. The investigation into the old business records was reopened, and the authorities also reviewed the circumstances surrounding Millie's accident. While we waited, our family struggled with the emotional weight of everything. Dana blamed herself for not realizing how frightened Millie had been. I reminded her that none of us knew the full story. Robert became more protective of us, constantly checking whether we were safe. I told him not to let fear control our lives. One evening, I sat alone in Millie's room. I opened her notebook again. Near the end, she had written a message directly to me. "Dad, if you're reading this, I'm sorry I waited. I thought I could solve everything before I came to you. I didn't want you to worry. You always taught me to face problems instead of running from them. I guess I was trying to protect you the way you protected me." I had to stop reading. I cried harder than I had since the funeral. I realized that she had been trying to protect me, while I had been wishing she would simply talk to me. The next morning, an investigator contacted us. They had found evidence that Victor and Thomas had been communicating about Millie's investigation. They had also discovered that Victor had lied about when he last spoke to her. That did not prove he had caused her accident, but it raised serious questions. The investigators eventually determined that the accident itself was caused by dangerous road conditions and another, unrelated driver's mistake. There was no evidence of intentional harm. I felt relieved that my daughter had not been deliberately targeted, but the relief was mixed with sadness. She had been frightened for reasons that were real, even though the greatest danger had not been what she feared. The business investigation continued. Eventually, the altered records were formally recognized, and my name was cleared from several transactions that had damaged my reputation. Years earlier, Thomas admitted that he had participated in hiding information, while Victor faced consequences for his role in manipulating records and pressuring Millie. None of it could bring my daughter back, but it gave me something I desperately needed: the knowledge that Millie had not been imagining the danger around her. She had been searching for the truth because she believed I deserved it. One evening, Robert sat beside me and said, "Dad, she wanted you to know." I nodded. "I know." Then he asked, "What do we do now?" I looked at Millie's photograph on the shelf and answered, "We finish what she started." Finishing what Millie started became more than correcting old business records. We created a small family project in her memory, focused on helping young people learn about financial responsibility and protecting themselves from manipulation. Millie had always cared about helping others. She believed people should have access to information before making important decisions. We decided that her name would be connected to something positive. Dana helped organize the project, while Robert handled the practical details. I visited schools and community groups to talk about lessons I had learned from my own experiences. I never told people that they should live in fear. I told them to ask questions, keep records, and speak to people they trust when something doesn't feel right. The business investigation eventually ended. My old company's records were corrected, and several people involved faced appropriate consequences. I received compensation for some of the financial losses, but I donated a portion of it to the project we created in Millie's memory. I wanted her legacy to be about helping people, rather than the people who had caused problems in our lives. Dana and I slowly learned how to live with grief. There were still difficult days. Sometimes she would walk into the kitchen and instinctively call Millie's name before remembering. Sometimes I would see a woman from behind who looked like my daughter and feel my heart stop for a moment. But we learned that grief does not mean forgetting. It means carrying love differently. Robert became closer to both of us. He visited more often and made sure we never isolated ourselves. One evening, he brought an old photograph album. We sat together and turned the pages. There was Millie at 5 years old, then 10, then 16, then 25. We laughed at some photographs and cried at others. Dinah eventually said, "I wish we had known that night would be our last conversation." I replied, "If we had known, we would have said everything." Robert looked at us and said, "Maybe you did say more than you realize." I thought about our final conversation. Millie had told me she loved me. I had told her I was proud of her. She had promised we would talk tomorrow. Maybe those words had been ordinary, but they were also full of hope. She believed there would be more time. So did I. That became one of the hardest lessons of my life. We often postpone important conversations because we assume tomorrow will be there. We tell ourselves we'll call later, visit next week, apologize tomorrow, or say what we really feel when the moment is right. But sometimes the moment is already the right one. Years later, I still keep Millie's notebook in a locked drawer. I don't read it often. I don't need to. I know what it contains. It contains the final thoughts of a daughter who loved her father enough to investigate something she believed was wrong. It contains questions, fears, memories, and one message that I will carry forever. One afternoon, Dana found me holding the notebook. She sat beside me and asked, "Do you still wish she had told you everything that night?" I nodded. Every day. She took my hand and said, "Then maybe we should make sure we never tell each other we'll talk tomorrow when we can talk today." Dana's words became something our family repeated whenever an important conversation came up. Don't wait for tomorrow. It wasn't meant to frighten us. It was a reminder to appreciate the people we still had. Over time, the project we created in Millie's memory grew. More families became involved, and young people attended workshops where they learned about basic financial decisions, personal responsibility, and the importance of asking for help when something seemed wrong. I often spoke at those gatherings. I never presented myself as someone who had all the answers. I simply told my story. I told them that I once believed tomorrow was guaranteed. I told them about my daughter and the sentence she said to me, "We'll talk tomorrow." Then I told them that tomorrow never came, but I also told them that her story did not end there. It continued through every person we helped, every family conversation we encouraged, and every young person who learned to speak before fear became silence. Dana and I remained close. We visited Millie's favorite places every year. One of them was a small park near our old home where she used to sit and read. We would bring flowers and talk about her as if she were still part of the conversation. Robert sometimes joined us. We never treated those visits as occasions only for sadness. We remembered the funny things she did, the way she laughed, the food she loved, and the small habits that made her who she was. One evening, years after her passing, I sat in that park alone. I opened the notebook one final time. I read the sentence she had written for me. "Dad deserves to know the truth." I closed the notebook and looked at the sky. I finally understood that she had given me more than the truth about my past. She had given me a reason to live differently in the present. I stopped postponing conversations. I called Robert when I missed him. I visited Dana's family more often. I told people I loved them without waiting for a special occasion. I apologized when I was wrong. I listened when someone said they were struggling. I learned that saying what matters today is not weakness, it is courage. Dana and I often talked about the last night with Millie. We wished we could go back, but we knew we couldn't. What we could do was make sure her final promise became a lesson rather than only a tragedy. One evening, Dana sat beside me and said, "Do you think Millie would be proud of us?" I looked at her and smiled. "I think she would tell us to stop worrying and keep going." Dana laughed through her tears. "That sounds exactly like her." We sat quietly together. I looked at the photograph of Millie on the shelf and realized something. I had not understood immediately after losing her. We cannot control how much time we are given. We cannot know which conversation will be our last. We cannot guarantee that tomorrow will come, but we can choose what we do with today. We can tell the people we love what they mean to us. We can ask the question instead of assuming the answer. We can forgive when forgiveness is possible. We can protect our families without allowing fear to control us. And we can carry the memory of those we lose by living in a way that honors them. My daughter once told me, "We'll talk tomorrow." Tomorrow never came, but her words stayed with me, and every day since then. I have tried to make sure that when someone I love needs to talk, I never tell them to wait, because sometimes the most important conversation of our lives is the one we almost postpone. If you like this video, respond us by comment, tell your places where you are looking from it. Make me happy to see people from different places, and don't forget to subscribe channel for more videos.